everyone, it's Sandra. So it was 50 days ago that I saved some worm cocoons from this dusty, dry wheelie bin, put them in a tray with some moisture, and then filled it with coconut coir to see if they would survive. Having seen no signs of life every time I've checked in on them every week or so over the past 50 days, I decided to go into the research to see what I could find out about dehydrated worm cocoons. I'm going to talk about the research as I go through this bin before I use a strategy at the end of the video that's a tip from a friend and one that I found supported by the research itself. All links to the research will be found in the description. The idea of cocoon survivability in dry condition is an important one for us to consider, not only as worm farmers that might have a dried out worm bin, but also when we consider how worms survive in the wild. Here on southern Vancouver Island, we're in a 30-plus year drought, so our worms must be able to survive, and their cocoons must be able to survive these adverse conditions. We all know that worms migrate to find moisture, and this is certainly the case in the wild as well. My research showed that Eisenia will dive deep to find moisture, even the little ones shortly after hatching. But worm cocoons cannot migrate, so these cocoons must have provisions to be able to survive drought conditions. I found evidence in the research that worms in the tropics have several strategies to survive dry conditions. One species of tropical worm only starts laying its cocoons at the onset of the rainy season. Another worm continuously lays cocoons year-round, but the cocoons go into a state of dormancy, and then they reactivate and start maturing once the rainy season begins. Although they didn't examine the Eisenia species, these tropical worm studies give me hope that my cocoons will survive. My research showed that a mean incubation period for cocoons is about 23 to 26 days, with a range of 14 to 44 days. Now, that was in ideal conditions of 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit and about 75% moisture. In these conditions in a research environment, approximately 73% of cocoons will hatch. Interestingly, worm cocoons often form clumps of substrate around them, the bedding, which is likely due to a mucus layer that's deposited with the cocoon itself. This helps the cocoons survive adverse moisture conditions. The research showed that cocoons contain a microbiome that's transferred from the worm parents. This is called vertical transmission, basically from the parent generation to the cocoon generation. Bacteria transmitted from these worm parents constitutes the majority of the bacteria found in cocoons, but not all. What seems to be a vital component of cocoon health are the bacteria transmitted horizontally, which means from the surrounding environment. These bacteria bring in more microbiota diversity and basically serve as an introduction to the cocoons, to their surrounding environment and the resources available. Without this environmental handshake, if you like, cocoons are not able to thrive. Only 73% of worm cocoons may be able to survive in research conditions because they do not represent the microbiome of a thriving worm bin. So my strategy today is to increase the microbial diversity of the environment for these cocoons. I'd previously dribbled some thawed juice from frozen bananas into the cocoon coir bedding, but I don't think that's going to be enough. My friend Anne, who supplied my ENC cocoons, suggested I place a nanny worm in with the cocoons. Her experimentation with raising cocoons through trial and error found that placing a single worm with cocoons greatly increases the survivability and maturation rate of those cocoons. The worm I'm placing does not have a developed clitellum, so there's no chance it will deposit a cocoon of its own. That means any wisps I observe will definitely be from the dehydrated cocoons. Because I now have a living worm in this bin, I'm now going to sprinkle in some finely ground up stale popcorn kernels so this worm can begin to deposit castings which will further embellish the microbiome of this coconut coir environment. Although coconut coir is a great moisture retentive bedding, I don't think it's a good food for growing worms. And I've never added grit to this bin before, so I'm going to sprinkle in some finely ground up eggshells to act as a pH buffer and a grit source for both my nanny worm and any wisps that develop. As you know, the microbiome also includes fungus, and research noted that worm cocoons that do not survive have a fungus growing on them. The researchers couldn't determine whether this fungus actually killed the cocoons or whether the fungus was simply opportunistic, taking advantage of a worm cocoon that had already failed and was starting to decompose. I didn't see any evidence of anything on the surface of my cocoons. They all look nice and healthy, so I'm just going to top up this bin with some moist tea leaves before I seal it up for the next check-in. I'm known as Nana to my grandchildren, and this worm is now going to be known as Nanny to these cocoons. I hope Nanny will spread some nice microbial diversity throughout these bins, and these cocoons will start showing signs of life. Fingers crossed. Bye for now.